She was already halfway out the burning door when she heard a child's scream cutting through the roar of the flames. Every instinct in her body said, run. Every sane thought said, get out. Ray Sullivan turned around, not because she was brave, not because she was supposed to, but because no one else was going to. If you've ever loved someone more than you loved yourself, stay with me, because this story is going to break you wide open. Subscribe, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Ashford estate at night was the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt held, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong. Ray Sullivan had worked in that house for 3 years. 3 years of early mornings and late nights. 3 years of ironing dress shirts she never wore and preparing meals she never ate at the table. 3 years of learning which floorboards creaked and which hallways to avoid when Mr. Ashford was on a call. She knew this house better than anyone, maybe even better than the man who owned it. But knowing a house and belonging in it, those were two different things. Ray had never confused the two. She was the nanny. That was the beginning and the end of it. Milo was 7, June was 4. Milo had his father's jaw stubborn and square, but his eyes were all his own. Wide and dark and full of questions he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask. He'd started sleeping with a small flashlight under his pillow 2 months ago, and when Ray had asked him why, he'd shrugged and looked away. Just in case, he said. June was different. June was a sunbeam wearing a little girl's body. She laughed at everything, clung to Ray's arm like a barnacle, and called her Ray Ray, even though Ray had gently corrected her probably 400 times. She'd stopped correcting her after the first month. She loved those kids, that was the truth of it. Not the complicated, professional kind of caring that came with a paycheck. The real kind. The kind that kept you up at night wondering if they were warm enough, wondering if someone had remembered to check under Milo's bed for the thing he swore lived there on Thursdays. She wasn't supposed to love them like that, but love has never been good at following instructions. The night it happened, Ray was in the East Wing laundry room, folding June's pajamas. She'd been in a mood all evening, not angry, just quiet in a way that felt like a bruise. Jenny Ashford had breezed through the house that afternoon wearing a coat Ray had never seen before and smelling like a perfume she definitely hadn't bought locally. She'd kissed both children on the top of the head with the kind of efficiency that made Ray's chest tighten. Efficient kisses, like she was checking boxes. She'd left again and by 6, said something to the housekeeper about an event, and was gone before either child had come downstairs for dinner. Milo hadn't said anything. He'd eaten his pasta in silence, cut everything into squares the same size, and excused himself without being asked. June had waited until she was sure her mother wasn't coming back, and then she crawled into Ray's lap at the kitchen table and put her thumb in her mouth, which she was technically too old for and absolutely not too old for, and Ray had just held her rocking slightly, not saying a word. Some nights you don't say anything, you just hold on. It was the smoke she smelled first. Not fire. Smoke. The specific dry electrical kind that meant something was wrong before the flames had a chance to announce themselves properly. Ray set down June's pajamas. She stood still for exactly 2 seconds, that particular stillness, before a body commits to action, and then she was moving. The hallway outside the laundry room was clear. She turned toward the children's wing. Milo, she kept her voice flat and even. She knew from experience that panic was contagious and calm was a choice. Milo, I need you to wake up. She pushed open his door. He was already sitting up, flashlight in hand, clicking it on and off, like he'd been waiting for the signal. Ray, he said, his voice was too steady for a 7-year-old. It scared her more than screaming would have. I smelled something. I know. She crossed the room in 4 steps. Put your shoes on. Don't worry about anything else. June. I'm getting June. Shoes, Milo, now. She could feel the heat before she reached June's room. The south hallway was warm. In a way, hallways are not supposed to be warm. The air had a weight to it, dense and wrong, and somewhere behind the wall there was a sound like something eating. June was awake and crying softly, sitting up in her bed, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Ray Ray. Her voice cracked. There's a sound. I hear it, baby. Ray scooped her up without breaking stride. Hold on to me. Don't let go. I won't. June's arms locked around her neck like a vice. I promise. Ray turned back toward the hallway. The wall at the end of the south corridor was orange. Not glowing, not warm, orange. The color was all the way through the plaster, pulsing like a heartbeat, and as Ray watched, a thin line of smoke appeared at the baseboard, and the air shifted, sharpening, getting hotter by the second. She had maybe 4 minutes before that hallway became impassable. She moved. Milo was in the doorway of his room, shoes on flashlight gripped in both hands like a weapon. "Is it a fire?" he asked. "Yes. No point lying to a kid who could see the orange glow around the corner. We're going out through the front staircase. Stay close to me and stay low." "Do you understand?" "Yes." "Don't stop walking for any reason." "Yes." "If I tell you to run, you run." "Okay." He reached out and grabbed the back of her shirt, not panicking, just holding on. Ray felt something in her chest crack wide open. She took a breath, she moved. The front staircase was still clear. The smoke was getting thicker by the second, rolling in from somewhere back in the house, the kind of deep gray that mixes with the air and makes everything look like an old photograph. Ray had June in her arms and Milo's hand in hers, and she kept her body low and her feet moving, and she did not let herself think about anything except the door. Just the door. Just the door. Somewhere behind them, glass broke. The sound of it was enormous, a full-body shatter that sent a pulse of heat through the air and made June scream and made Milo's hand grip hers so hard she felt the bones shift. "Keep going," Ray said. She wasn't talking to them anymore. She was talking to herself. They made it to the front foyer. Ray could see the door, heavy oak brass handle, 10 feet away, and she exhaled one single breath of relief before she heard it. A small choked sound, coming from the study off the right side of the foyer. She stopped. Milo looked up at her. "Ray." She was already doing the math. June in her arms, Milo beside her, door 10 feet away, study 6 feet to the right. Whatever was in that study making that sound. She turned her head. The study door was half open. Through the gap in the thickening gray air, she could see the shape of a child's shoe. Small, pink, June's size. Except June was in her arms. Her brain stalled for half a second, and then she understood. June's old doll, the one she'd named Baby Other June, and stuffed under the study couch 2 weeks ago. She'd been asking for it for days. But the sound wasn't a doll. Ray looked again, and this time she saw the hand. There was a child on the floor of the study. Not Milo, not June. A child she didn't recognize, small, maybe 3, curled up under the desk with both hands pressed over their ears, making that small, choked, terrible sound. Ray's mind went perfectly blank. Who is this child? She had no time to answer. She had no time to do anything except choose. She looked at Milo. He was watching her with those 2 old eyes. "Take your sister," she said. "What a Milo." She lowered June into his arms. He staggered under the weight but held on. "Go to the front door. Open it. Stand on the steps and do not move. I will be right behind you." "Ray, go." He went. She went into the study. The child under the desk was a boy. Dark hair, red cheeks, eyes screwed shut, both hands still clamped over his ears, like if he pressed hard enough, the world would stop being on fire. "Hey!" Ray dropped to her knees. The smoke was lower here, thicker, and she could feel the heat coming up through the floor. "Hey, I've got you. Look at me." He opened his eyes, brown eyes, scared to the core. "Can you stand up?" He shook his head. She didn't argue. She picked him up. He weighed more than June. She didn't have time to notice. She was already moving back through the door across the foyer, 5 steps. 3 steps. 1 step. The heat hit her from behind like a wall. Not gradual, not building. A wave. A roar. A section of the ceiling in the east corridor gave way with a sound like a gunshot, and the air was suddenly full of orange and black, and something that wasn't smoke anymore, something that was just heat, pure and pressurized and wrong. Ray threw herself forward. Her right arm caught it. She didn't know until later, didn't feel it, until later, the way you don't feel a bad cut until you see the blood. But her arm came down across the doorframe at the exact moment the fire found the oxygen in the foyer, and the sleeve of her uniform went up, and she was outside stumbling onto the steps, setting the boy down, and Milo was there, and June was there, and all 3 children were crying or screaming, and Ray was on her knees on the front steps, and the house behind her was fully, completely, irreversibly on fire. She looked at her arm. She looked away. "Count to 3 for me," she said to Milo. Her voice was calm. That specific calm that lives on the other side of something terrible. "Count out loud." "1," he said, his voice shaking. "2, 3. "Good." She looked at June. "Can you say your name, June Ashford?" June was crying so hard she could barely speak. "Ray, your arm." "June, name." "June Ashford," she hiccuped. "June Marie Ashford." "Good girl." Ray looked at the boy she'd carried out. "What's your name?" He stared at her, soot on his face, tears cutting tracks through it. "Marco," he whispered. "Okay, Marco." She didn't know who he was. She didn't know where he came from, or how he'd gotten into that study, or why no one had come for him. She didn't have room in her body right now for those questions. "You're safe." He nodded very slowly, like he was trying to believe it. Behind them, another section of roof gave way. Ray pulled all 3 children in close, putting her body between them and the sound, and she held them. This woman who was nobody in this house, this servant, this employee, she held all 3 of them in her arms, and she did not let go. She had no idea where Jenny was. That thought arrived quietly without drama, somewhere between the moment the first fire truck appeared at the gate and the moment the paramedics found her sitting on the front lawn with 3 children pressed against her sides. Jenny Ashford was not here. She had left at 6. She had kissed her children with her efficient kisses. And she was not here. A paramedic was crouching in front of her, saying something about her arm, asking if she could hear him asking for her name. Ray answered on autopilot. She gave her name. She told him the children were fine. She told him they hadn't inhaled much smoke. She did not look at her arm again. "Ma'am," the paramedic's voice was gentle. "We need to treat this." "After the children," she said. "They're already being after the children." He didn't argue. He flagged another medic. June had her face buried in Ray's neck, her fingers twisted into the collar of Ray's ruined uniform. Milo was sitting exactly 2 inches to her left, close enough to touch without touching, which was his way. Marco had fallen asleep against her right side, which was probably shock, which the paramedics would need to know about. She opened her mouth to tell them, and that was when the black car came through the gate. She knew the car. Everyone at the estate knew that car. Black, long, moving too fast to be anything other than emergency or emergency. It hadn't even stopped fully before the door opened. Cale Ashford hit the ground moving. Ray had seen Cale Ashford in many states over 3 years. Controlled, cold, dangerous in the specific way that very powerful men are dangerous, not loudly but absolutely. She had seen him end phone calls with 2 words. She had seen men twice his size go quiet when he walked into a room. She had never seen him look like this. His face was open in a way she had never seen it, stripped down to something raw and undefended, something that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the animal need to know if your children are alive. He saw Milo first. Something moved through his face that Ray didn't have a word for. "Dad?" Milo stood up, his voice cracked. "Dad, we got out." Cale crossed the lawn in 5 strides and dropped to his knees and pulled Milo against his chest. And Ray looked away because that moment didn't belong to her. June, hearing her father's voice, lifted her face from Ray's neck. "Daddy!" She scrambled to her feet on legs that were still shaking and ran to him. Ray stayed still. She watched Cale Ashford hold both of his children, watched him close his eyes, watched his shoulders shake once, just once, before he locked it back down. Then he looked up. His eyes found her across the lawn. She was sitting in the grass in her ruined uniform, her right arm wrapped in the paramedic's preliminary dressing, her face gray with smoke and probably blank as a wall because she had nothing left in her for expression. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't know what he saw. She wasn't sure she cared in the way that you stop caring about things that aren't survival when you've been at the edge of not surviving. Cale Ashford stood up. He said something to his children. She couldn't hear it. He handed them both to the paramedic, something firm and instructive in his voice. And then he walked toward her. Ray didn't get up. She wasn't sure she could. He stopped 2 feet away, looked down at her, looked at the bandaged arm, looked at the soot on her face and her burned sleeve, and the 3-year-old she was still, even now, keeping a hand on. "Who got them out?" he said, His voice was quiet, the quiet that comes after something enormous. Ray met his eyes. I did, she said. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was something earlier than gratitude, something more fundamental, the look of a man who has just understood and his understanding of something was entirely wrong. You went back in, the paramedic said from behind him. He was addressing Cale, not Ray. Sir, your employee went back in. There was a third child in the study. Marco. Cale's voice changed. The name landed differently in his mouth. Marco was in there. He was under the desk, Ray said. He couldn't move. Cale looked at her. You carried him out. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. Yes. Silence. Behind them, the estate continued to burn. The fire crew was managing it now. Contained, the captain had said, contain meaning. Not spreading, not meaning stopped. The east wing was already gone. The study was gone. The children's wing was gone. 3 years of her life in that house. The laundry room where she'd spent 1,000 evenings folding small pajamas. The kitchen where June had learned to say her name. The hallway outside Milo's door where she'd once sat for an hour at midnight, back against the wall just listening to make sure his breathing was even. All of it was gone. Cale Ashford was still looking at her. You're hurt, he said. I'm fine. You're not fine. She didn't argue. She didn't have the energy to argue. He crouched down in front of her, this man who ran an empire, this man who did not crouch for anyone, and he looked at her at eye level and he said very quietly, why didn't you leave? Ray looked at him. She thought about the question. She thought about the right answer, she's professional answer, the answer that made sense for a woman in her position. She thought about Milo's flashlight, June's thumb in her mouth, Marco under the desk with his hands over his ears. Where would I go? She said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then the paramedic was there, and Cale stepped back, and Ray let them take her arm, and she didn't look at him again. But she felt him watching, and she understood in the bone-deep, exhausted part of her that understood things without words that something had changed tonight. She just didn't know yet what it would cost her. She should have known then. She should have read the look on his face for what it was. But Ray Sullivan had spent 3 years being invisible in that house, and invisible people don't look for the signs that someone has finally started to see them. She would learn. Orchestrated dramatic narrative with rapid pacing dialogue, heavy storytelling, and interwoven plot twists. Orchestrated dramatic narrative with rapid pacing dialogue, heavy storytelling, and interwoven plot twists. The hospital was too quiet for a night that loud. Ray sat on the edge of the examination bed with her right arm stretched out in front of her, watching the doctor work with the focused detachment of someone who had run out of feelings and was simply waiting for the next instruction. The burns weren't as bad as they could have been. That was the phrase the doctor kept using. Not as bad as they could have been. Like that was supposed to be comfort. Like not as bad was the same as fine. She didn't respond. She watched his hands. She breathed. The room outside the curtain was busy. The controlled chaos of a hospital on a hard night. Voices overlapping, wheels on linoleum, someone calling for a chart. Normal sounds, human sounds. Ray focused on them the way you focus on a fixed point when the world is tilting. She heard Milo before she saw him, his voice carrying through the curtain, too serious for a child asking if someone in the hall, whether Ray was in the room at the end, whether she was okay, whether he could see her. She closed her eyes. Hey, the doctor's voice was gentle. You still with me? Yes, she said. I'm here. The curtain moved. Milo came in first, still wearing his pajama pants and the sneakers he'd put on in the dark, and he stopped at the foot of the bed and looked at her arm, and his jaw tightened in a way that was so completely his father's face that Ray almost couldn't look at him. You didn't tell me it was bad, he said. It's not bad. That's not what the doctor said. And the doctor said, I heard him, Milo said. I was in the hallway. I heard everything. A beat, then quieter. Why didn't you leave when you had the chance? Ray looked at him. You know why, she said. He looked at the floor. Something moved through his face, too complicated, for seven, too real to be anything but what it was. He crossed the room and sat down on the plastic chair next to the bed, without asking permission, without being invited. And he sat close enough that his shoulder was touching her knee. He didn't say anything else. She didn't either. That was enough. June arrived a minute later, led by a nurse who looked vaguely harassed, and June took one look at Ray in the bed and burst into immediate, devastating tears. Ray, she sobbed, reaching up. I want to hold your hand. The other hand, baby. That side. June grabbed her left hand in both of hers and held on so hard Ray could feel every small knuckle. She didn't ask for it back. What she didn't see, what she had no way of knowing yet, was that on the other side of that curtain, Cale Ashford was standing in the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice completely flat and completely cold, saying to someone on the other end, "Find her. I don't care what it takes. Find Jenny and you bring her to me tonight." A pause. "No," he said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." He ended the call. He looked at the curtain, and he stood there for a long moment, not moving, with an expression on his face that no one in his organization would have recognized, because Cale Ashford did not look like that in front of people who worked for him. He looked lost. Then he straightened. He put the phone in his pocket. He pulled the curtain back. Ray looked up. She had not expected him to walk in personally. She had expected a driver maybe, or a phone call through someone with a title. Not him, not in person, not with those eyes. "How bad?" he asked the doctor. The doctor looked between them, reading the room with the practiced neutrality of a man who had worked a hospital for 20 years and understood that not all power was visible. "Second degree on the forearm. She's going to be bandaged for several weeks. She'll have some scarring." He paused. "She's going to be fine, but she needs rest. Real rest." Cale nodded. He looked at Ray. "You're moving to the main residence." She blinked. "I'm sorry. You're not going back to the staff quarters." He said it the way he said most things, not as a question, not as a request. "You'll recover in the main guest suite. I'll have it arranged tonight." "That's not necessary," Ray said. "I know it's not necessary." "Mr. Ashford, you saved my children's lives." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was a weight to it that had nothing to do with volume. "You went back into a burning building for a child you didn't even know. You will not recover in the staff quarters." The room was very quiet. June was still holding Ray's hand. Milo was watching his father with those watchful eyes. Ray looked at Cale Ashford, at the way he was standing, the controlled stillness of a man who had made up his mind and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. She had seen that stillness before. She had learned not to argue with it. "Okay," she said. He nodded once. That was all. He turned to the doctor and began asking questions in that efficient way of his, and Ray sat in the bed with June holding her hand and Milo's shoulder against her knee, and she felt something shift in the air of the room that she couldn't name. She filed it away. She didn't look at it directly yet. She wasn't ready. The thing about Cale Ashford that most people misunderstood was that his power wasn't loud. It wasn't in the cars or the suits or the men who stood at the back of rooms when he entered. It was in the quality of his attention. When Cale Ashford focused on something, the something changed. It didn't have a choice. Ray had spent 3 years being invisible to that attention. She had preferred it that way. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant you could do your work and love the children and exist in the edges of a life that wasn't yours without anyone asking questions you didn't have answers to. She had not planned on being visible. She had not planned on any of this. The ride back from the hospital happened in Cale's car. She didn't argue about that either. June fell asleep across Ray's lap within 4 minutes of the car moving, which was 4 minutes faster than usual, and probably everything catching up with her small body all at once. Milo sat in the front, which was unusual. He normally sat in the back, and Ray understood it was because he wanted to ask his father something and needed the physical distance of the front seat to do it. She heard him say very quietly, "Where's Mom?" Cale didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. "She's being reached." "Reached," Milo repeated the word like he was tasting it. "She doesn't know yet about the fire." A pause that lasted 1 second too long to be comfortable. "She'll know soon." Milo said nothing. Ray watched the back of Cale's head. She watched his hands on the wheel loose, controlled the hands of a man who never let anything show in his body that he hadn't chosen to put there. She thought about that pause. 1 second too long. The word reached, carefully chosen. The fact that Jenny Ashford, as of this moment, had been gone for hours and her children had nearly burned alive inside her house and she had not called once. Ray pressed her lips together and looked out the window. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself that a lot about a lot of things in that house. It was the refrain of 3 years. Not your business. Not your place. You're the nanny. You love the children. The rest of it is not yours. She was very good at that refrain. She was beginning to be less good at believing it. The guest suite was on the second floor of the main house, the undamaged one, Cale's personal residence, which was attached to the estate but separate from the east wing where the fire had started. It was large and clean and entirely impersonal, the kind of room that had everything you needed and nothing that was yours. Ray sat on the edge of the bed. June had been put down in the room next door. Milo had said goodnight in his careful way, and she'd watched him shut his door with a quietness that made her want to go back and knock. She didn't. The silence of the room felt enormous. Her arm was wrapped from wrist to elbow. She could feel it, not as pain exactly, more as presence, a weight that hadn't been there before. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought, this is what it cost. She thought it could have cost more. She thought Marco. Marco, the boy from the study. She still didn't know who he was, how he'd gotten into that room, why no one had come for him. She'd asked the paramedic at the estate, and the paramedic had looked at her strangely and said he'd been transferred, that a man had come for him, that there were people handling it. People handling it. She hadn't pushed. She knew instinctively, with the bone-deep knowing of 3 years in Cale Ashford's house, that some questions in that household didn't have answers she was allowed to have. She lay back on the bed. She stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep. At 2 a.m, she heard the voices. They were downstairs, muffled through the floor and the walls, but present. 2 voices. One of them was Cale's. Low controlled the specific register of a man who is furious and has chosen precision over volume. The other one was Jenny's. Ray sat up. She heard Jenny's voice rise sharp and defensive, that particular pitch of someone building a case for themselves before they've been accused. She heard Cale say something short and flat. She heard Jenny's voice again, higher this time, and then a silence that lasted too long, and then a sound she couldn't identify, and then nothing. She waited. Footsteps in the hall, heading away, not toward her. A door closing somewhere at the far end of the house. Then quiet. She lay back down. She kept her eyes open. She was still awake at 3 when the knock came. It was so quiet she almost didn't register it as a knock. Just 2 small sounds against the door, tentative, the kind of knock you make when you are not sure you should be making it. "Come in," she said. The door opened. Milo, still in his pajamas, flashlight in hand, clicking it on and off. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Me neither." He came in. He sat on the floor next to the bed, not in the chair. The floor back against the side of the mattress, and he clicked the flashlight on and let it point at the ceiling, making a small white circle on the plaster. "She came back," he said. "My mom. I heard. They were arguing." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The circle of light on the ceiling didn't move. "She wasn't there," he said, "when the house was on fire. She wasn't there." Ray didn't say anything. "That's not the first time," he said. Very quiet, very precise. The voice of a child who has been counting things for a long time and has finally run out of room to pretend that count doesn't matter. "She leaves, a lot. And it's always an event or a thing or whatever. And she always comes back, and it's fine. She makes it fine. But tonight," he stopped. "Tonight it was different." "Yes," Ray said. "It was." He turned and looked up at her. His face in the dim light was very young and very old at the same time, and Ray's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Are you going to leave?" he asked. The question landed like something dropped from height. She opened her mouth, closed it. "Your arm," he said quickly, like he was filling the space before she could say something he didn't want to hear. "You're hurt because of us, because of me and June, and you could have—" He stopped, swallowed. "You could have left before it got bad. You had time. I know you did." "Milo? I'm not stupid. I know you're not." "Then answer me." He held her gaze. "Are you going to leave?" Ray looked at this 7-year-old boy with his flashlight in his 2 old eyes and his careful way of holding himself together when everything around him kept falling apart, and she thought about all the careful, professional answers she had stored up for moments like this. All the "we'll see, and let's not think about that right now, and your dad will figure everything out." She thought about them all. She set them aside. No, she said, I'm not leaving. He looked at her for a long moment, searching for the soft spot in the answer, the place where the professional distance was hiding. He didn't find it. His shoulders dropped half an inch, just that tiny release of something he'd been holding, and he turned back to face the wall and pointed his flashlight at the ceiling again. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. He fell asleep there on the floor next to her bed about 20 minutes later. She heard his breathing slow and even out. She reached down carefully with her good arm and put her hand on the top of his head, barely touching the way you touch something you don't want to wake. She thought, these are not my children. She thought, that doesn't matter. She thought, I am in so much trouble. And then she closed her eyes and finally she slept. In the morning, she woke to the sound of an argument. Not raised voices. Cale Ashford didn't do raised voices in his own home. She'd learned that early. But the particular silence between words that was worse than shouting, the charged quiet of two people saying things to each other that had been waiting a long time to be said. She didn't move. She lay still and she listened to Milo's even breathing from the floor, and she waited. Jenny's voice through the wall. She's the nanny, Cale. She works for us. She was doing her job. Cale's voice flat. Her job doesn't include second-degree burns. Everyone is making this into more than it is. She went back in. A pause. Twice silence. You want to make her some kind of hero, Jenny said. And now there was something else in her voice, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She saved the children. Good. She did her job. I will thank her personally. Where were you? Cale said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ray had ever heard. That's not... Where were you, Jenny? Not a question. Never a question with him. Ray heard Jenny's footsteps, moving away. The sound of a door, not a slam, controlled everything in that house, was controlled, and then nothing. Ray opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling. Milo stirred on the floor, blinking, reaching automatically for his flashlight before his eyes were even fully open. Morning, Ray said. He looked up at her. There was a bruise under his left eye from last night. She'd missed it in the dark, just a shadow probably from when he'd stumbled in the hallway during the evacuation, and she hadn't had a free hand to catch him. Did you hear them? He asked. No, she said. He looked at her. He knew she was lying. She knew he knew. Neither of them said anything about it. June's going to wake up soon, Ray said. She's going to want breakfast. She always wants breakfast. Waffles, Milo said with the certainty of someone who had cataloged his sister's preferences with scientific precision. She only eats waffles when she's upset. I know. Ray sat up slowly. Her arm ached with a low, steady persistence. Come on, let's go make waffles. He stood up. He straightened his pajamas. He picked up his flashlight and clicked it once on and off and put it in his pocket. Ray, he said at the door. She stopped. My dad was outside your room last night, he said. For a while. I saw him when I came down the hall. Ray went very still. He didn't knock, Milo said. He just stood there. He looked at her with those eyes. I don't know what that means. She didn't know either. She was starting to think that not knowing was going to be the most dangerous thing about all of this. Come on, she said. Waffles. He followed her into the hallway. Neither of them looked at the door. Orchestrated seamless narrative continuation with dramatic pacing and emotional depth. Orchestrated seamless narrative continuation with dramatic pacing and emotional depth. The waffles were a negotiation. June wanted them cut in triangles. Milo said triangles were structurally unsound for syrup distribution, and they should be squares. June said squares were boring. Milo said boring wasn't a food criticism. June said she was telling Ray. Ray, standing at the counter with her bandaged arm held slightly away from her body and a spatula in her good hand, said they were getting rectangles, and that was final. Both children looked at her. Rectangles, she said again. Milo sat down. June sat down. Rectangles it was. That was the thing about the morning after a disaster. Life didn't pause for you. Breakfast still had to happen. Children still had opinions about waffle geometry. The world kept its ordinary rhythm even when you were standing in someone else's kitchen, in someone else's house with burns up your forearm and a feeling in your chest like something had been rearranged overnight and hadn't settled back into place yet. Ray kept moving. That was all she knew how to do. She had just set both plates on the table when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. measured, deliberated. She knew that particular sound, had known it for 3 years, had learned to track it the way you learn to track weather. Cale walked into the kitchen and stopped. He looked at the table, at the children eating, at Ray standing at the counter with a spatula she was now holding for no reason. His expression did something brief and complicated, and then went still. "You cooked," he said. "Someone had to." He sat down at the table. Not at the head of it, he sat in the chair closest to June, which was not where he normally sat, and June looked up from her waffles with syrup on her chin and said, "Daddy, rectangles," in a tone that suggested this was information he needed immediately. "Rectangles," he said seriously. "Good call." June beamed. Milo rolled his eyes but said nothing. Ray turned back to the counter. She heard Cale say something low. To June, heard June's small laugh, heard the ordinary sounds of a family at breakfast, and she stood very still with her back to all of it, and felt the particular ache of being adjacent to something that wasn't yours. "Ray," his voice behind her. She turned around. He was looking at her across the kitchen with an expression she couldn't read. "Sit down. I'm fine standing. Your arm is elevated because you keep forgetting to rest it. Sit down." She opened her mouth, closed it. She sat down. He pushed the plate of extra waffles toward her side of the table without comment, and she looked at it, and she thought, 3 years, and this is the first time I've sat at this table. She didn't say that. She picked up a fork. They ate in a silence that was strange because it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just full, like the room was holding too much, and everyone had agreed without speaking to let it sit there undisturbed. It was Milo who broke it. "Where's Mom?" he asked, casual. Too casual, the way he always asked the questions that mattered most, buried in a tone designed to make them sound small. Cale set down his coffee cup. "She's resting." "Is she hurt?" "No." Milo nodded. He cut his waffle into a square, then another square, then another. His eyes were down. "Milo," Cale said. "I'm fine," Milo said. "I know." A pause. "We're going to talk later. The 3 of us." Milo looked up. Something passed between father and son, some language Ray didn't have access to, some understanding that had been built over years of the 2 of them reading each other in rooms where no one else knew what was happening. Milo nodded once. June, entirely unconcerned with the adult undercurrents swirling around her waffles, held up her plate. "More syrup, Ray." Ray poured the syrup. Life kept moving. It always did. The knock came at 10:30. Ray was in the guest suite attempting to change the bandage on her arm with one hand, and a level of determination that was beginning to feel like stubbornness, when she heard voices downstairs shift in that particular way. Voices shift when a new energy enters a room. Sharpening, pulling together. She wrapped the bandage badly. It would have to do. She heard Jenny's voice, then Cale's, then another voice, male, low, someone she didn't recognize. And then all 3 went quiet, and a door closed, and the house went back to its held-breath silence. She sat on the edge of the bed. She had been in this house for 3 years, and she still didn't know fully what Cale Ashford's world looked like from the inside. She knew the surface of it, the cars, the calls, the men who appeared and disappeared without introduction, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She knew what she was supposed to know, which was nothing, and she had been good at that. Deliberately good. But the fire had changed the geography of things. She was no longer in the staff quarters. She was no longer at the edges. She was sitting in the guest suite of the main house, eating breakfast at the family table, and the man who ran one of the most dangerous operations in the city had looked at her last night in a way she couldn't stop thinking about. "He stood outside your door," Milo had said, for a while. She pressed her palm flat on her knees and told herself to stop. The door opened without a knock. Jenny Ashford was beautiful in the specific way that required maintenance polished to a high shine, always every detail managed. This morning she looked almost normal, which meant she looked like a woman who had slept badly and covered it carefully. She was wearing something cream-colored and composed, and she stood in the doorway of the guest suite with her hands folded in front of her and looked at Ray with an expression that Ray recognized immediately. It was the expression of a woman who needed something and had decided the most efficient path to getting it was to be pleasant. "Ray," her voice was warm, practiced warm. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," Ray said. "Thank you." Jenny came in. She sat down in the chair by the window without being invited, which was fine because it was technically her house. She crossed her legs. She looked at Ray's arm. "That looks painful," she said. "It's manageable." "You were so brave." The warmth dialed up slightly. "What you did for the children, I haven't had a chance to say it properly." "Thank you. Truly." Ray looked at her. She said nothing. Jenny's smile stayed in place, but something behind her eyes shifted just slightly, just enough for a person who had been watching people for 3 years to catch. "I wanted to talk to you," Jenny said, "before things get any more complicated." "Complicated? How?" Jenny tilted her head. A practiced gesture, sympathetic and measured. "Cale can be overwhelming. When he's grateful, when he feels he owes something." She paused. "I want to make sure you understand the situation clearly." Ray waited. "You're an extraordinary employee," Jenny said. "Truly, the children adore you, and what you did last night was remarkable. But I think you're smart enough to know that extraordinary moments don't change ordinary realities." She smiled. "You'll be compensated very generously. We'll make sure you have the best medical care. And of course, your position here is completely secure." "I wasn't worried about my position," Ray said. "Of course not." The smile again. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, that the gratitude doesn't become something confusing for anyone." Ray looked at this woman, at the careful architecture of her, at the way she had built this little speech, brick by brick, each word placed to do a specific job. She thought about last night, about Jenny's shoes clicking on the front steps with that efficient walk heading away, about Milo's voice in the car, she doesn't know yet, about the fire, about June's thumb in her mouth at the kitchen table. "Mrs. Ashford," Ray said very quietly, "where were you last night?" The smile didn't disappear, but it froze, just for a second, just a fraction, just long enough. "I told Cale." "I'm not asking what you told Cale." Something happened in Jenny's eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something colder than anger. Recognition. The look of a person who has just realized the person they came to manage is not in fact manageable. She stood up. She smoothed her pants. She looked at Ray with an expression that had given up on warmth entirely. "I see," she said. "I'm just the nanny," Ray said. "You said so yourself," a beat. "Get some rest," Jenny said. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped her. Back still turned. "And Ray Cale's gratitude is real. It's also temporary. Men like him don't make servants into something else." A pause. "They just think they do." She left. Ray looked at the door for a long time. She thought she's scared. She thought she should be. She thought not of me, of herself, of what she knows she did, and what he's starting to understand. She thought this house is going to catch fire again. Different kind of fire. And this time I'm standing right in the middle of it. Marco was the key she hadn't turned yet. She'd been pushing it to the edges of her mind since the night of the fire, the boy under the desk, the small hand brown eyes terrified behind soot-streaked cheeks. Someone had taken him from the hospital before she could ask questions. A man had come for him. That was all anyone would say. But Cale had known his name. That was the thing she kept coming back to. In the chaos of the lawn, in the orange light of the burning estate, when the paramedic had mentioned a third child, Cale's face had changed. The name Marco had landed in his mouth differently than a random name would land. It had weight. It had history. She was turning this over in her mind when June appeared in the doorway, both arms out, requiring a hug with the urgency of someone who had decided that Ray's bandaged arm was not a sufficient barrier to contact. Ray opened her good arm. June climbed in. She smelled like syrup and shampoo and herself that specific small child smell that Ray had learned was one of the most effectively disarming things in the world. "Daddy wants you," June said against her neck. "Now, I know." He said, "When you're ready." June lifted her head. He said, "That means now." Ray looked at her. June looked back with June's eyes, which were very smart and had never pretended otherwise. "Okay," Ray said. She found him in the study on the ground floor, not the one that had burned the other one, the one off the east side of the main house that he used when he was home. He was standing at the window with his back to her phone in his hand, not looking at anything in particular. She knocked on the open door. He turned. He gestured to the chair across from the desk without speaking. She sat. He sat. He put the phone face down on the desk. He looked at her. How's the arm? He asked. I told you. I know what you told me. A pause. Doctor, Renner is coming at noon. He's the best reconstructive specialist on the East Coast. He'll assess the scarring. Ray opened her mouth. Not a discussion, he said. She closed her mouth. He was quiet for a moment. He had that quality, that ability to sit in silence without filling it, without performing discomfort, which was unusual and slightly unnerving, and probably it explained a great deal about how he'd built what he'd built. Marco, he said. There it was. Ray went still. You've been thinking about him, Cale said. It wasn't a question. You knew his name, she said. He looked at her. Yes. Who is he, Tom? Cale leaned back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, something working behind his eyes, the look of a man deciding how much of a door to open. He's my son, he said. The room went very quiet. Ray stared at him. Not Jenny's, he said. He's 4 years old. His mother, that's a long story, and not one I'm telling today. But Marco has been in my care for 8 months. Privately. Staff quarters on the south side of the estate. He paused. The south side is where the fire started. Ray was doing the math. The south corridor, the heat through the walls, the way the fire had moved so fast. He was in the study, she said, alone. His caretaker panicked, Cale said, and there was something in those 3 words contained, held down, ice over something volcanic, that told her exactly what had happened to that caretaker in the aftermath. She got out. He didn't. He was 3 years old and she left him, Ray said. Yes. The word landed between them. Ray thought about Marco's hands over his ears, his brown eyes, the way he'd said his name in the dark, like it was the one piece of himself he was sure of. Marco, barely a whisper. He's here now, she asked. He arrived this morning. He's in the East Suite. Ray stood up. Cale watched her. Ray, which one is the East Suite? He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face, not surprise originally, but something adjacent. The look of a man watching something happen that he hadn't calculated for. End of the hall, he said. Past the linen closet. Blue door. She was already at the door. Ray, she stopped. Thank you, he said. For Marco, specifically. He paused. I don't say things like that often. I want to make sure it registered. She looked at him over her shoulder. It registered, she said. The boy was sitting in the middle of the bed with his knees pulled up, staring at the door when she opened it. He was clean now. Someone had bathed him, changed his clothes, and he looked smaller in the daylight than he had in the dark and the smoke. Just a little boy. Small fists, dark hair, brown eyes that recognized her immediately. Hi, Marco, she said. He stared at her. She sat down on the edge of the bed at a distance that wasn't crowding, and she just looked at him. Do you remember me? She said. A pause, then very slowly he nodded. You carried me, he said, like he was checking. I did. He looked at her arm, at the bandage. Does it hurt? He asked. A little, she said. Not too bad. He seemed to be making a decision. She could see it in his face, the interior debate of a 4-year-old weighing variables she wasn't entirely privy to. He reached out and put his hand very carefully on top of her bandaged arm. Just rested it there, barely touching. She looked at his hand. Small, warm. Okay, he said, apparently satisfied with whatever conclusion he'd reached. I'm Marco. I know, she said. I'm Ray. Ray, he repeated. Not Ray like June. Not Ray with the careful enunciation Milo used. Just Ray. Straight and simple, like a thing he'd decided to remember. She sat with him. She thought about what Cale had said. 8 months, privately. A child kept on the south side of the estate while Jenny lived in the main house and Milo and June lived in the east wing, and the whole apparatus of the Ashford Empire turned around them. A child nobody talked about. Nobody acknowledged. A child whose caretaker had run and left him under a desk. She thought about Jenny's face this morning, the careful speech, the managed warmth. She thought about Jenny knowing, whether Jenny knew. Whether that was the thing underneath all the careful architecture of this morning. Not jealousy about Ray, not really, but the specific terror of a woman who has been managing a secret and just watched the secret almost die in a fire. Her thoughts were moving fast and she let them, because she was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a story about a fire. This was a story about a family that had been building toward a breaking point for a very long time, and the fire had not started the collapse, it had just made it visible. And Ray Sullivan, who had spent 3 years being careful and invisible and professionally distant, was sitting on a bed next to a child nobody had claimed in a house that was splitting at the seams with burns on her arm and a look from a powerful man the night before that she could still feel like a brand. She had told Milo she wasn't leaving. She was starting to understand what staying was actually going to cost. Marco patted her arm once carefully and looked up at her. "Echo, are you staying?" he asked. The question hit her in the same place Milo's had. Same words, different voice, same bottomless need underneath. She looked at this boy, this child nobody had claimed, nobody had come back for. Nobody had carried out of the fire until her. "Yes," she said. He nodded, like that settled something. He leaned against her side, very slowly testing, and she didn't move away, and that was answer enough. He closed his eyes. She sat there with Marco asleep against her arm, and June's laughter somewhere down the hall, and Milo's careful footsteps on the stairs, and she thought, this is not what I was hired to do. And then she thought, I don't care. Downstairs, Jenny Ashford made a phone call she didn't make from the house phone. Ray didn't hear it. She had no way of knowing. But 3 floors below in the front sitting room, Jenny stood at the window with her back to the door, and her voice very low, and said to someone on the other end of the line, "It's moving faster than I thought. We need to talk about the other thing." A pause. "Yes, the boy." Another pause longer. "I know what I agreed to. I'm telling you the situation has changed." She hung up. She looked out the window. She looked like a woman who had just made a choice she couldn't take back. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with dramatic pacing requirements. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with dramatic pacing requirements. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Ray learned the geography of the main house, the way she had learned the estate, not by being shown, but by moving through it, by paying attention, by understanding which rooms held what kind of silence. She learned that Cale's office door being closed meant do not knock. She learned that Mrs. Park, the housekeeper, made coffee at exactly 6:45 and would pour you a cup without being asked if you showed up at 6:50 and didn't make conversation. She learned that the east sitting room got good light in the morning and that Marco, when given a choice, always moved toward good light. She also learned that Jenny Ashford left the house every day, between 10 and noon, returned composed and rearranged, and interacted with her children in the precise, efficient way that Ray had cataloged for years, but now could not look at without something tightening in her jaw. The children noticed. They always noticed. They just didn't have the language for what they were noticing, so they did what children do. They routed around it. Milo read more. June laughed louder. Marco, who had no established pattern yet, simply stayed close to Ray and watched the adults around him with the serious brown eyes of a child processing a great deal more than anyone gave him credit for. On the morning of the 4th day, Dr. Renner came for the 2nd visit and confirmed what Ray had already suspected: the scarring would be permanent. Not severe, not disfiguring, but there along the inside of her forearm, a permanent record of the night she had turned back instead of running. She looked at it after he left. She traced the edge of it with her finger. She thought I would do it again. She thought that's the part that should scare me. She thought it doesn't. Cale was in the doorway when she looked up. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there. Long enough, apparently, to have watched her examine the damage without flinching. "Renner give you the full picture?" he asked. Yes, he came in. He sat down in the chair across from her, the same chair Jenny had sat in 4 days ago, but it felt entirely different when he sat in it, like the room rearranged itself around him. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. He looked at her arm. "I should have had better security," he said, "for the estate, for the fire systems. I should have..." He stopped. "You weren't there," she said. "That's exactly my point." She looked at him. "You couldn't have known." "I know a lot of things that most people don't know about how fast situations can turn." His jaw tightened. "I should have applied that to my own home." He paused. "Instead, a woman I employed took burns protecting my children because I was 3 hours away doing business that could have waited." Ray was quiet. "I'm not looking for absolution," he said. He looked up at her directly. "I'm telling you so you understand that I understand what happened here, what it kept." She held his gaze. Why does it matter that I understand that? A pause. The kind that meant the answer was real. Because you're the only person in this house who tells me the truth, he said. The words landed quietly, without drama, all the more devastating for it. Ray looked away first. I'm going to check on Marco, she said. He didn't stop her, but she felt his eyes on her back all the way to the door. The truth about Marco was expanding daily. Ray had pieced it together the way she pieced most things together in that house, carefully from fragments, never by asking the question directly. Marco's mother had been gone for 2 years. A woman named Sophia, whose name existed in the house only in the way silences can exist in the space people left around a subject. Something had happened to Sophia, something that Kale carried in the set of his shoulders when Marco called him daddy, in that uncertain way, like he was still checking whether the word was permitted. Marco had been in the care of a series of people over those 2 years. The last one had run from the fire. He had night terrors. Ray learned that on day 2 at 2 in the morning, when she heard the sound through the wall and was in his room before she was fully awake, operating on the specific instinct that had been built by 3 years of nighttime duty. She'd sat on the edge of his bed and talked to him quietly until he stopped shaking. She hadn't turned on the light. She had found through experience that children in that state needed voice more than visibility. So she talked. She said whatever came about the morning, about waffles, about June's ongoing campaign to rename all the houseplants, about Milo's flashlight, and why it made sense and was actually very smart. He'd fallen back asleep in about 15 minutes. She was at the door when he said very quietly, "Don't go yet." She had sat back down. She'd been there until 4. She didn't tell Kale about the night terrors. Not yet. She filed it in the category of things she was learning, things she was managing, things that would require a longer conversation when the time was right. She had a whole category like that. It was a large category. It was getting larger. On the morning of the 5th day, the first crack appeared in Jenny's composure. It happened at breakfast. June had asked in the direct way that 4-year-olds ask things that adults have been carefully avoiding, why mommy and daddy didn't sleep in the same room anymore. The table went quiet. Kale set down his coffee cup. He looked at June with the careful expression of a parent buying time. Jenny looked at her plate. Sometimes grown-ups need different kinds of sleep, Kale said. June considered this, like how Marco doesn't sleep good. Another silence. Marco has bad dreams, Milo said with the flat helpfulness of someone who considered it his job to provide accurate information. Everyone knows that. Jenny's head came up. It was the first time Ray had seen her look at Marco directly, fully, without the managed peripheral awareness she usually applied to him, the way you look at something you've decided doesn't require your full attention. She looked at him and something crossed her face that Ray couldn't entirely name. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't cruelty, it was something older and more complicated, something that had been living in her for a long time and had just been startled out of its hiding place. Marco was looking at his waffle. How do you know that? Jenny said to Milo. Ray sits with him, Milo said. I hear her go down the hall. Jenny looked at Ray. Ray met her eyes, steady, neutral, waiting. Jenny looked back at her plate. Kale was watching all of this. Ray knew without looking that he was watching all of this, reading it with those eyes that never missed anything, turning it over in that mind that was always calculating 3 moves ahead. She looked at her coffee cup. The silence held for about 10 more seconds. Then June said, "More rectangles, please." And the moment broke and life moved forward, and no one at that table said what any of them were actually thinking. That was the morning. The afternoon was different. Ray was in the east sitting room with Marco and June when she heard the front door. Not the usual sound of it, the everyday opening and closing that was just part of the house's rhythm. This was different, urgent, voices in the foyer, multiple voices, men. June looked up from her drawing. "What's that? Stay here," Ray said. She went to the doorway. 2 men she didn't recognize were in the foyer, both in dark coats, both with the specific quality of stillness she had learned to associate with people who worked for Kale in ways that weren't discussed at dinner. One of them was talking to Kale in a low voice, rapid something in his posture that was past urgency and into the territory of controlled alarm. She caught 3 words. Not an accident. That was all. 3 words. But the way Kale's face changed when he heard them, the way the controlled surface of him shifted underneath a tectonic thing barely visible, terrifying in its smallness, told her everything she needed to know about what those words meant. She stepped back into the sitting room. "Everything okay?" Marco asked. He was very good at reading adults, better than a 4-year-old should be. "Yes," she said. Her voice was even. "June, show Marco the flower you drew." June, who needed zero encouragement to show anyone anything that she had drawn, launched immediately into a detailed presentation. Marco listened with genuine attention because Marco was that kind of person even at 4. Ray sat down. She put her hands in her lap. She thought, not an accident. The fire. They were saying the fire was not an accident. She thought about the South Corridor, the specific way the heat had moved too fast, too directed. She had attributed it to old wiring, to the particular vulnerability of large houses that had been renovated too many times. She had not questioned it because she had been busy surviving it. She questioned it now. Jenny's phone call came back to her. The situation has changed. She hadn't been meant to hear that. She had been upstairs in the hall on her way back from the linen closet at 11 at night, and Jenny's voice had carried up the stairwell in the specific way sounds carried in that house at night, too clear, too close. "I know what I agreed to. The situation has changed." Ray sat very still in the east sitting room and let the shape of it come together. Not an accident. Jenny leaving at 6 before the fire. Jenny, who had never in Ray's experience left the house at 6 on a weeknight without being asked 3 times first. Jenny, who had kissed the children with those efficient kisses. Jenny, who had upon returning shown more anxiety about Ray's position in the household than about the fact that her children had nearly died. The boy. That was what Jenny had said on the phone. Yes. The boy, Marco. Ray's hands tightened in her lap. She thought she wanted him gone. She thought not the children, Marco. She wanted Marco gone, and the fire was supposed to solve that, and something went wrong. She thought Milo and June were in that wing too, and she knew that she knew which wing they slept in. She kissed them before she left. She stopped herself. She did not know that. She was assembling from fragments and instinct and 3 words through a doorway. And she did not know that, not for certain, and she would not say it out loud, because saying it out loud made it real. And if it was real, then the woman in this house had Ray. June's voice, small, insistent. "You're not listening." Ray looked at her bright eyes and her drawing, and the small person. She was entirely unaware of what was moving through the house around her. "You're right," Ray said. "I'm sorry, show me again." She looked at the drawing. She made herself focus. She listened to June explain the flower in the specific detail that June applied to all things she considered important. Underneath, her mind kept moving. She had to talk to Cale. Not tonight. Not with 2 men in dark coats in the foyer and whatever was being discussed in that low, urgent register. But soon, tomorrow. She had to tell him what she'd heard, what she was thinking, what the shape of it looked like from where she was standing. She was the nanny. This was not her business. She had told herself that for 3 years. She looked at Marco, listening to June with his whole heart, his small hand resting on the table between them, like he was ready to grab hold if the world tilted again. She was done telling herself things that weren't true. She found Cale at 9 that night. The children were asleep. The 2 men in dark coats were gone. The house had settled back into its surface quiet, the kind that now felt different to Ray. Not peaceful, not held, but deliberately constructed, like the quiet was a choice being maintained by effort. He was in the downstairs study with the door half open. She knocked anyway. He looked up. "I need to tell you something," she said. He gestured to the chair. She didn't sit. "I heard Jenny on the phone," she said. "Mati nights ago, late. I wasn't listening, I was in the hall." She paused. She said the situation had changed. She said they needed to talk about the boy. She kept her eyes on his face. She meant Marco. Cale had gone very still. Not the controlled stillness of his normal operating mode. A different stillness. The stillness of a man who has just had a suspicion he didn't want to have confirmed. "And today," Ray said, "I heard your men in the foyer. I heard 3 words. I don't know the context, but I heard not an accident." The room was absolutely silent. He stood up. He turned away from her. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she watched the line of his shoulders, and she understood she was watching a man rearranging a very large number of things inside himself at very high speed. She waited. "How long ago," he said, "did she make that call?" Night of the fourth day, after she came to see me in the morning. He was quiet. Cale. She never used his name. She had never used his name in 3 years, not once. She used it now without thinking, without deciding to. I could be wrong, it could be coincidence. But the children were in that wing and she knew, he said. His voice was flat, absolute. The voice of a man who has just decided something. He turned around. His face was composed, entirely terrifyingly composed. The composed face of a man who has put everything he was feeling cannot interfere with what has to happen next. I need you to do something, he said. Okay. The children sleep in the same wing as you tonight. All 3 of them. Don't make it dramatic. Just make it happen. Ray looked at him. You think she'd... I don't know what she would do, he said. And the precision of that sentence, don't know from a man who always knew, told her exactly how serious this was. I'm not willing to find out. Okay, she said again. She moved toward the door. Ray? She stopped. The second time he'd said her name in 5 days. Both times it had stopped her completely. You could have told me about the phone call the day after you heard it, he said. Why tonight? She thought about it. Really thought about it. Because this morning at breakfast, I watched her look at Marco, she said, and I saw something in her face I haven't seen before. She paused. I didn't want to be wrong. I needed to be sure. He held her gaze. Are you sure? He asked. She thought about Marco's hand over his ears in the dark, the way June had waited at the table for a mother who had already left, Milo counting squares in his waffle with his eyes down. Yes, she said. He nodded. She went upstairs. She moved the children without fanfare, made it a sleepover. Made it June's idea, let Marco carry his one small stuffed animal down the hall with the gravity of a child performing an important task. Milo came without being asked, which meant he had understood more than she'd said, which did not surprise her at all. She got them settled. She sat on the floor between the 2 beds in the large guest room with her back against the wall and her knees up the way she'd sat outside Milo's door 100 times before all of this. June fell asleep in 4 minutes. Marco took longer. His breathing was careful, controlled the breathing of a child who had learned that relaxing fully was a risk. Ray, he said from the dark, I'm here. You're not leaving. Not leaving. A pause. Okay. The smallest exhale. The careful breathing began to slow. Okay. Milo from his bed said nothing, but she heard him reach under his pillow and take out the flashlight and hold it, not clicking. It just holding, just in case. She sat against the wall. Downstairs, she could hear Cale's footsteps. Back and forth in the study, steady and deliberate, the sound of a man working through something that had no clean solution. She listened to that sound. She let herself find it somehow grounding. She thought about what came next, about the thing she had just put in motion by telling him what she'd heard, about the way his face had looked composed over something that was not composed at all, something that was a father's rage and a husband's grief and something colder than both, something that belonged to the part of him that ran an empire and had not until now turned that part of himself toward his own household. She thought about Jenny somewhere in this house making whatever calculations she was making. She thought about Marco asleep with his breathing finally slow and even. She thought, I am the nanny. She thought, I have been the nanny. She thought that word is getting very, very small. At some point she slept. She didn't mean to. She woke at 2 to Cale standing in the doorway looking at her against the wall and the 3 children in their beds. He had a glass of water. He set it on the floor next to her without speaking. He looked at his children for a long moment, all 3 of them, and there was something in that look, something that counted and checked and breathed out when everything added up to safe. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. There was nothing to say that the room hadn't already said for them. He left. She picked up the glass of water. She drank it. Outside somewhere a car started and pulled away from the house and didn't come back before morning. Ray didn't know then that it was Jenny's car. She would find out in approximately 6 hours when Cale knocked on the guest room door at 8 in the morning and told her with that flat, precise voice and that composed face that Jenny had left. Not left the room, not left for an event. Left. And that when his people had gone to understand why they had found in Jenny's second phone a conversation that made the fire look like the smallest of her decisions. Ray would stand in that doorway holding a cup of coffee and feel the floor of everything shift underneath her. But that was in 6 hours. Right now she sat in the dark with 3 sleeping children and a man's footsteps fading down the stairs, and she held the glass of water he had brought her with both hands, her burned arm and her whole arm, and she let herself feel for the first time in 5 days the full weight of where she was. Not at the edges, not invisible, right in the center of it, right where she had never planned to be. Orchestrated final narrative installment, Voy mini climax twist, Vaket Tukman. Orchestrated final narrative installment, Voy mini climax twist, Vaket Tukman. The coffee was still hot when Kale knocked. Ray heard him in her sleep, or the edge of her sleep, that thin place where consciousness reassembles itself before you're ready, and she was standing before she was fully upright. One hand on the doorframe, the other still holding the reflex of reaching for a child that wasn't directly next to her. All 3 were still in the guest room. She'd checked at 6. Still breathing. Still safe. She opened the door. Kale looked like a man who had not slept. Not in the disheveled way, never that not him, but in the way that showed in the eyes that particular flatness that came from a mind that had been running at full capacity through the dark hours and had not been given permission to stop. He was dressed. He was composed. He held a coffee cup that was clearly not his first. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "She's gone, and I know why." Ray stepped back. He came in. He sat down in the chair. He set his coffee cup on the table and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for 3 full seconds before he looked up at her. "The fire investigator confirmed this morning," he said. "Accelerant. South corridor, 2 points of origin deliberately set." He paused. Jenny's second phone had 46 messages over the past 3 months. 46 to a man named Reeves. He used to run acquisitions for a competing organization. He said used to in a way that was not past tense in any ordinary sense. The agreement was Marco. They wanted him. Jenny agreed to deliver him. Ray sat down on the edge of the bed. "Why?" she said. "Marco's mother was Sofia Vega." He watched Ray's face. Her brother is Daniel Vega, which means Marco is Daniel Vega's nephew. He paused. "Daniel Vega currently controls the eastern ports. He has no heir. Marco is the closest thing he has." Another pause. "Anyone who controls Marco controls Daniel's cooperation. That's a $200 million calculation." Ray stared at him. "She agreed to that," she said. Not a question. She agreed to that. The silence that followed was the kind that needed to be sat in for a moment. Ray let herself sit in it. She thought about Jenny's composed face, her efficient kisses, the careful architecture of her management of this household. 3 months of 46 messages building toward a 4-year-old boy under a burning desk. "The children," Ray said, "Milo and June, they were in that wing." His jaw moved, just once. Reeves told her the fire would be contained to the south side. She believed him. He stopped. Or she told herself she believed him. Ray looked at her bandaged arm. "She didn't know I'd go back in," she said quietly. "No." His voice went somewhere very flat and very cold. "She didn't account for you." The weight of that landed between them and sat there. "Where is she now?" Ray asked. "Somewhere I know about." He said it in that way, the way that meant the conversation about Jenny was for him already a different kind of conversation than it had been 12 hours ago. He was not a man who left loose ends. She had always understood that about him abstractly. She understood it differently now. "She won't come back here. She won't come near the children." Ray nodded. He looked at her, really looked at her the way he'd been doing more and more over the past days with that quality of attention that rearranged the air. "Milo asked me this morning," he said, "if you were going to stay." She met his eyes. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was your decision." He paused. He said he already knew the answer. Another pause. "He said you told him weeks ago." Something moved across his face. "He remembers everything." "I know," she said. "He's like you." That landed somewhere in him. She saw it. He looked away briefly and then back. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "And I need you to answer it the same way you answer everything straight. No managing me, no professional distance." He held her gaze. Why did you stay in this house? 3 years. You are overqualified for what I was paying you. You're smarter than half the people on my payroll. You could have left 6 different times when the work got difficult or the situation got complicated. Why did you stay? Ray was quiet for a moment. She thought about the question. The real answer, not the safe one. Because of them, she said. Milo and June. Because nobody was. She stopped, started again. Children need someone in their corner who isn't counting anything. Not favors, not money, not position. Someone who is just there, completely there. She looked at her hands. They didn't have that. I could see it from the first week. And I couldn't leave something I could see. He was silent. That's the whole answer, she said. No, it isn't, he said. She looked up. He was watching her with that steady gaze, and she understood that he meant what he'd said. No professional distance, no managing, and that he was going to sit there and wait for the rest of it with exactly the patience of a man who had built an empire by being willing to wait longer than everyone else. She breathed out. I stayed, she said, because it started as being about the children, and then it became about something bigger than that, and I didn't know how to leave something I'd grown into. She paused, and I told myself for 3 years it was professional, that it was just care. For the kids, that's all it was. And now, he said, the room was very quiet, and now my arm has a scar on it that didn't have to happen, she said. And there are 3 children down the hall who asked me not to leave, and you brought me water at 2 a.m. without saying a word, and I am done pretending that any of this is still just professional. He stood up. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and he stopped in front of her, and she stood up because she was not the kind of person who stayed sitting when something important was happening, and they were standing 2 feet apart, and the morning light was coming through the window, and her bandaged arm was between them, like a fact neither of them could argue with. I have a complicated life, he said. I know. It doesn't get less complicated. It gets managed, but it doesn't disappear. I know that too. You'd be giving up a certain kind of safety, he said, the kind that comes from being at the edges of things, from being invisible. I gave that up the night I turned back, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and very carefully, very deliberately, he put his hand over her bandaged arm. Not gripping, just covering. The warmth of it traveled up through the gauze and the careful wrapping and whatever was underneath, and she did not move. I know what it cost you, he said. I'm not going to pretend I don't know. And I'm not going to pretend I'm not asking you to risk more by staying. He paused. But I'm asking. She looked at his hand over her arm. She thought about all the things she knew about this man. The power and the cold precision of him. The way he dropped to his knees on the lawn when he saw his children. The water at 2 a.m. The look on his face outside her door that Milo had described when he hadn't knocked. She thought about all the things she was walking into with both eyes open. I know, she said. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. He read the answer in the same place he read everything, the thing underneath the words, the true register of it, and something in his face settled the way a thing settles when it's been moving for a long time and finally finds its weight. He stepped back. He picked up his coffee cup. The moment reorganized itself into something that could be lived in, which was different from something that needed to be survived. The children are going to want breakfast, he said. Julie will want waffles, she said. She always wants waffles. Because she's upset. She's going to be upset for a while. I know, Ray said. I'll handle it. He looked at her. That small, almost thing that lived at the edge of his mouth that she had decided was as close as he got to a smile in the morning. I know you will. He left. She stood in the room for a moment. She looked at her arm. She pressed her palm against the gauze, lightly feeling the shape of what was underneath. Permanent, Dr. Renner had said. She thought good. She thought let it be permanent. She thought let it mean something permanent. She went to make breakfast. The conversation with the children happened at the table. Not planned, not staged. It happened the way real things happen in the middle of waffles, because June asked where Mommy was, and Milo looked at his father, and his father looked at Ray, and Ray looked at all 3 children and thought they deserved the truth. An age-appropriate truth, shaped carefully, but truth. Mom is going to be living somewhere else for a while, Cale said. June's fork stopped moving. Milo said nothing. He had already known Ray thought, had known in that bone-deep way of his, had been waiting for the word that confirmed the count. Is she coming back? June asked. Cale looked at his daughter. I don't know yet, Junie. We're going to take it one day at a time. Does she know where we are? Yes. Does she know I'm okay? Something passed through Cale's vein. Yes, she knows. June looked at her waffle. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Ray. Are you staying? She asked. The table went absolutely still. Milo looked up. Marco looked up. Cale did not look up, which was a different kind of looking. Ray looked at June, at her bright, direct, devastating eyes. Yes, she said. I'm staying. June picked up her fork. Okay, she said. And that was that. The way children do it, the economy of their acceptance, the speed with which they move from catastrophe to the next necessary thing. Milo exhaled quietly. Marco went back to his waffle. The table resumed its ordinary sounds. Ray looked at her coffee cup. She felt something in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Not happiness, exactly. Not relief. Something more solid than either the feeling of a foundation that has been tested and held. The twist came at 11. Ray was in the east sitting room with Marco when Mrs. Park appeared in the doorway with an expression Ray had never seen on her face in 3 years of watching it. Mrs. Park was a woman of absolute composure. She had managed this household through things Ray didn't have full knowledge of and had always looked exactly the same, calm, capable, slightly above it all. She did not look that way now. There's a man at the gate, she said. He says his name is Daniel Vega. Ray went very still. Marco looked up from the toy he was examining. He's asking for the boy, Mrs. Park said quietly. Ray stood up. She crossed to Marco in 3 steps and she crouched down in front of him. Hey, she said, I need you to go with Mrs. Park for a few minutes and stay in the kitchen. Can you do that? He looked at her, reading her, 4 years old and already so good at reading adults that it broke her heart every time. Is it bad? He asked. No, she said. Everything's fine. I just need you to stay with Mrs. Park. He studied her for 1 more second. Then he stood up and took Mrs. Park's hand with the trust of a child who has decided to trust. Ray straightened. She went to find Cale. He was already in the foyer. He had the look, the specific, particular look that she had now seen enough times to catalog. Not anger, beyond anger, the cold place, the operational place where emotion became fuel instead of noise. You heard, she said. Yes. What does he want? He wants what everyone wants. Cale's voice was flat. He wants Marco. He'll claim blood rights. He'll argue I have no legal standing to keep him. He paused. He's not wrong about the law. Ray looked at him. But he is wrong about me. He said it simply, the way he said most things that were absolutely true. Marco has been in my care for 8 months. Sophia gave him to me before she died because she trusted me and she did not trust her brother. I have documentation. I have intent. I have 8 months of that child's life in this house. He stopped. And I have a very good lawyer. Cale. He looked at her. What did Sophia tell you about Daniel? A pause. Something moved in his eyes, a door opening a small amount and then closing. She said he would come for Marco if he knew where he was. She said not to let that happen. Is Marco safe here legally? In the next 24 hours. He held her gaze. I'm going to make sure he is. She believed him. She believed him not because she was naive about what that meant, not because she had any illusions about how a man like Cale Ashford made things happen, but because she had sat in this house for 5 days and watched him look at Marco, really look at him, and she knew the look of a man who had decided that a child was his to protect. She had worn the same look herself for 3 years. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her for a moment. The question seemed to land somewhere unexpected. Nothing dangerous, he said. I need you to keep the children inside. Keep them calm. Don't let Marco hear what's happening at the gate. Already done, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. Already done, he repeated quietly, like he was getting used to it, like he was deciding he could. He went to the gate. Ray went back to the kitchen. Daniel Vega left 45 minutes later. She heard the car. She tracked the sound of it past the gate and down the road and into the distance. She was at the kitchen table with Marco and June teaching them how to make paper boats from the newspaper Mrs. Park had produced from somewhere, and she kept her voice even and her hands steady and she did not let either child see the way she was listening. Marco folded his newspaper very precisely. He had small, careful hands like he'd learned early that careful was how you kept things. When the car sound had completely faded, he looked up at her. "He's gone," he said. She looked at him. 4 years old. Well, yes, she said. He nodded. He looked back at his paper boat. He folded the last corner. "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." The word of a child who has been afraid for a long time and has learned not to show it, but cannot always stop the truth from coming through. Ray put her hand over his. He didn't pull away. Cale told her that evening what had been said at the gate. Not everything she understood. There were things she wasn't getting the full shape of decisions being made in registers she didn't have clearance for. But he told her enough. Daniel Vega had made his claim. Cale had made his counterclaim, supported by documentation that Sophia had filed with a private attorney 18 months ago, documentation that named Cale as Marco's guardian of choice in the event of her death. Legal and notarized and airtight. Vega had left. He would try other avenues. Cale would be ready for them. "It won't stop," Ray said. "No," he agreed. "It won't stop, but it won't succeed either." He looked at her. "I need you to know that. I need you to know what you're in the middle of. Clearly." "I've been in the middle of it," she said, "since I turned around at a burning door." He was quiet. "I'm not saying that to be dramatic," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true. I know what this house is. I know what you are. I have known for 3 years and I stayed anyway." She paused. "I'm not afraid of complicated. I'm afraid of pretending things are simple when they're not." He looked at her for a long moment. "Sophia said something to me once," he said, "before she got sick. She said the problem with people in this life is they keep trying to protect the people they love from the truth of it. She said it never works. She said the only thing that actually protects people is letting them see clearly and trusting them to choose." Ray held his gaze. "She was smart," Ray said. "Yes." Something moved in his face. "She was." He paused. "She would have liked you." The words arrived simply without performance, and they were the most devastating thing he had said to her in 5 days. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The evening settled into something that was almost ordinary. Dinner, children at the table, Milo explaining to Marco the strategic advantages of flashlights, June redesigning everyone's waffle preferences according to a system that made sense only to June, the house finding its new rhythm tentative and real, the rhythm of people who have been through something together and are learning what they are on the other side of it. Ray watched all of it. She watched Cale cut Marco's waffle without being asked, watched Marco notice and not comment, just eat, just trust. Watched Milo let June win an argument for the first time in recorded history, which meant he was paying more attention to her than he was letting on. Watched June's eyes go to the empty chair once briefly and then come back to the table, back to the waffles, back to the present tense. She thought, this is not the family this was. She thought, this is not the family it's going to be either. She thought, this is the family it's becoming right now in this room with these people over these waffles. She thought, I am part of it. Not the nanny, not the employee, not the woman at the edge who managed the mornings and folded the pajamas and loved from a careful distance. Something else. Something that didn't have a clean title and didn't need one. After dinner, after the children were settled, after the house had gone to its night quiet, she stood in the hallway outside the 3 bedrooms and listened to 3 sets of breathing, slow towards sleep. Milo, June, Marco. 3 different rhythms settling into the same house, the same night, the same ordinary and extraordinary safety of being in a place where someone was standing at the door. Cale came up the stairs. He stopped next to her in the hall. He looked at the 3 closed doors. He listened the same way she was listening. They stood there together in the dark hallway without speaking, 2 people who had arrived at the same place through entirely different roads, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had happened in the past 5 days and everything that was still going to happen, and the specific gravity of 3 children breathing in 3 rooms, and the understanding, shared and wordless, that this was what it came down to. Not empire, not power, not the things that men like Cale Ashford built to prove they were untouchable. This. 3 doors. The sound of sleep on the other side. He looked at her. She looked at him. You should rest, he said. His voice was quiet, the real quiet, not the controlled one. So should you, she said. I will. He didn't move. Ray, she waited. I'm not going to let anything happen to them, he said, or to you. She thought about all the things that sentence contained, all the weight of it, the promise and the complication and the truth underneath both. I know, she said. Do you believe it? She looked at him for a moment. At this man who had stood outside her door in the dark and not knocked, who had brought her water at 2 a.m. and said nothing, who had crouched to her level on the burning lawn and asked why she hadn't left. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He went to his room. She stood in the hallway a moment longer. Her right hand rested against the wall, the burned arm, the scarred arm, the permanent record of the night she had turned back instead of running. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. She felt the solidness of the house underneath her hand. This house that had been foreign territory for 3 years and was now something else entirely. This house that had caught fire and lost a wing and lost a marriage and found things it hadn't known it was missing. She thought about where she had started. Invisible, careful, professional, loving from the margins of someone else's life. She thought about where she was standing now. Ray Sullivan, who had been nobody in this house, who had come in through the service entrance and eaten in the kitchen and folded the small pajamas, had walked back into a burning building, not because she was brave and not because it was her job, but because love had made the choice before her mind had caught up with it. And that choice, that one turn back, that one refusal to run, had remade everything. The family, the house, the man, herself. She was not the nanny anymore. She was not a servant. She was not invisible. She was not at the edges of someone else's life, managing it carefully from a distance, pretending the distance was fine. She was the woman who had walked back through the fire, and she was staying, and every person in this house knew it, and no one, not Daniel Vega, not the ghost of Jenny's calculation, not the complicated machinery of everything Cale Ashford had built, was going to change that. She pushed off the wall. She walked down the hall. She went to her room and she lay down in the dark and she closed her eyes, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not hold herself apart from the life she was living. She let herself belong to it, and that finally was everything.